The desert stretched endless, a white, hot ocean of dust and silence. Nothing moved but the wind, curling in thin, spiteful breaths across the hardpan. A lone buzzard traced circles above the canyon, patient as time. Below, a man staggered through the red rock and sand, his boots dragging furrows behind him. Blood, dark and half dried, slicked his side. His hat hung low, shadowing eyes gone dull from fever and thirst. He had been riding for days after the ambush. The others were dead, maybe 6 of them, maybe more. The memory came and went, broken into flashes. Gunfire, the scream of his horse, the sting of grit in an open wound. He remembered falling, waking to silence, and realizing the world hadn't bothered to notice his dying. By the time he reached the mouth of the canyon, the sun was a hammer on the back of his neck. He dropped to one knee, tried to steady himself, but the ground tilted and rolled under him. He laughed then, dry and cracked, because it seemed a fine joke to die surrounded by so much nothing. He didn't hear the horse until it was almost on him. A shadow slid across the sand, and he lifted his head. The sight made him blink, unsure whether it was real or another trick of heat and death. A woman sat astride a chestnut mare, still as stone. Her hair, long and black as obsidian, was braided tight down her back. Her face held the kind of calm that didn't come from peace, but from surviving too much to be frightened any more. She wore a leather vest over a faded blue shirt, moccasins instead of boots, and across her saddle rested a rifle that looked well used. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind hissed between the rocks. He tried to stand, failed, and managed a grin that was more grimace than charm. "Don't suppose you've got water to spare, ma'am." She studied him like he was some strange coyote limping too close to camp. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, even, carrying the weight of someone who didn't waste words. "You're a long way from your own kind." He coughed a laugh that turned into a groan. "Seems that way. Guess I took a wrong turn at the last saloon." She swung down from the saddle with easy grace, the rifle still in her hand. Sand whispered beneath her boots as she walked toward him. Up close, he saw the faint scars along her arms, the silver glint of a pendant shaped like a wolf's tooth. She crouched beside him, unwrapping a small pouch from her belt. Cool fingers pressed against his wrist, checking for life. His pulse thudded weakly under her touch. She looked at the wound near his ribs, clean through, but the edges blackened with fever. "You'll die if you stay here," she said, matter of fact. He stared past her at the horizon. "Maybe that's all right." Her gaze flicked to his face, unreadable. She had seen men talk like that before, the ones who'd stopped fighting long before they fell. She stood, dusted her hands, and looked down at him for a moment that felt longer than the silence around them. Then she held out her hand. "Get on my horse, handsome cowboy." He blinked, thinking he'd imagined it. Her tone wasn't mocking. It was steady, firm, almost kind. "What for?" "Because I won't let you die alone." He wanted to argue, to tell her he'd already made peace with the dirt and the sky. But there was something in her eyes, steady, stubborn, ancient, that broke through the fever and the pain. He reached for her hand. It was strong, calloused, warm. With her help, he hauled himself upright, swaying as the world swam around him. She guided him toward the mare, murmuring something in her own language that the horse seemed to understand. When he faltered, she steadied him with an arm around his back. The scent of smoke and sage clung to her skin. She lifted him onto the saddle, climbed up behind him, and wrapped one arm around his chest to keep him from sliding off. "Hold on," she said. He tried to answer, but the words caught in his throat. The last thing he remembered was the sound of hooves against stone and the feel of her heartbeat against his shoulder, steady and sure, as the canyon walls began to blur into darkness. And then, for the first time in days, he stopped thinking about dying. Night fell slow and heavy across the desert, the kind of night where the stars came out sharp enough to cut. The cowboy drifted in and out of consciousness, swaying with the motion of the horse. Each step sent a pulse of pain through his ribs, but it was distant now, softened by fever and exhaustion. He became dimly aware of the rhythm of her breathing behind him, steady and calm, the faint brush of her braid against his shoulder when the wind changed. The scent of her smoke, leather, wild say, jankered him to the living world. Somewhere far away, a coyote called, and the sound seemed to echo inside him, half memory, half dream. He didn't know how long they rode. Hours, maybe, days. Sometimes he opened his eyes to see the silhouette of mesas against the stars. Other times he saw her face in the flickering blur between waking and sleep. Once he thought he heard her speaking softly to the horse in a language he didn't know, the syllables rising and falling like water running over stone. When he came to himself again, the world was lit by the thin silver of dawn. They had stopped near a spring tucked between boulders, hidden by tall grass and shadow. The air was cool, smelling faintly of damp earth and juniper. He lay on a blanket near the fire, the ache in his ribs dull but deep. She sat beside him, grinding something in a small clay bowl with a smooth stone. He stirred and her eyes flicked up. Without speaking, she poured a little water into his mouth, then went back to her work. The paste she was making smelled bitter, sharp, like pine needles and smoke. "You could have left me," he said, his voice a rasp. She didn't look at him. "I don't leave the living to the vultures." He watched her spread the mixture across a strip of cloth, her fingers quick and sure. "Ain't many would have stopped for a dying man, not out here. You talk too much for someone half dead," she said, but her tone wasn't unkind. She lifted the edge of his shirt, revealing the angry wound beneath. He hissed as she pressed the poultice to it, but the sting faded quickly into a cool burn that dulled the pain. "What's in that?" he asked. "Medicine my mother taught me," she said simply. "It draws the sickness out. Maybe." He managed a faint smile. "Maybe's good enough." She finished bandaging him and sat back, wiping her hands on a rag. The firelight caught in her eyes, turning them the color of copper. For the first time, he noticed how young she was, not in years, but in the way her face softened when she stopped guarding it. "You got a name?" he asked after a moment. "Names have power," she said. He waited, but she said nothing more. The silence stretched until the fire cracked, sending up a tiny shower of sparks. "I had a horse once," he said quietly. "Good animal, never let me down. He died when they ambushed us. Guess I should have gone with him." She looked up, studying him for a long breath. "If the desert wanted you dead, it would have taken you already." He tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough. "You talk like the desert's alive." "It is," she said, turning back to the fire. "Everything that survives here has teeth." For a while, neither spoke. He lay listening to the wind slide through the grass, to the slow rhythm of the spring trickling nearby. Her hands moved as she cleaned her knife, careful and deliberate. There was no fear in her, no hesitation. He found it strange, comforting somehow, that she treated saving his life like any other chore, one more duty in a long list of them. When the stars began to fade, she pulled her blanket tighter and said, "Rest. The fever will come again before it breaks." He nodded, eyes already closing. "You ever sleep?" "Sometimes," she murmured. "When there's no one left to keep alive." He wanted to ask her who she'd kept alive before him, but the question dissolved as sleep claimed him. He dreamed of fire and smoke, of the woman's song threading through the night, low and ancient, carrying the sound of wolves across the canyon. He dreamed of water, cool and clean, washing the blood from his skin. When he woke again, the sun was high, and she was sitting cross-legged beside the spring, carving something small and careful from a piece of bone. The mare grazed nearby, tail flicking lazily at the flies. He pushed himself upright, and she glanced over, one eyebrow raised. "You shouldn't move yet." "Feels strange lying still while someone else does the work," he said, voice rough. "You'll get used to it," she replied, then almost smiling, "or you'll die before you do." He laughed softly, wincing at the pull in his ribs. "You always this kind." She met his gaze, calm and unflinching. "Kindness isn't the same as mercy." He thought about that as she rose, poured water into a tin cup, and handed it to him. The sun caught the edge of her cheekbone, gilding her in gold. Somewhere inside him, something loosened, like a knot beginning to come undone. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the cowboy felt the faint, stubborn pull of life again. It wasn't mercy that kept him alive, he realized. It was will, hers, and maybe his own. By the time the sky began to pale with morning light, the cowboy was strong enough to sit a horse again. The fever had burned itself out, leaving him leaner, quieter, and somehow older. The wound still ached when he moved, but it no longer owned him. She had taught him how to clean it, how to chew the bitter leaves that kept the pain at bay, how to listen to the desert's silence without being afraid of it. They broke camp before dawn. She packed the last of the ashes from the fire into the earth with the heel of her boot, erasing every trace of their stay. He watched her move, the way she seemed to belong to the land in a way he never could. The chestnut mare waited nearby, patient and alert, her breath misting faintly in the chill air. They rode side by side through the narrow canyon, the sound of hooves echoing off the stone walls. The air was still cool from the night, but the promise of heat already shimmered on the horizon. For a long time neither spoke. Words felt small out here, too fragile to survive among the rocks and wind. The cowboy finally broke the silence. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. "Leave the desert? Yeah, find a town, settle somewhere that's got more water and less dust." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "And do what there? Sit inside walls, waiting for the world to end?" He shrugged. "Ain't much of a world out here either. The desert is honest," she said. "It takes what it wants, and it gives what it must. Towns lie. They promise safety, then steal your spirit." He looked at her, trying to read the expression on her face. "Sounds like you've seen a few towns do that." She didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, full of unspoken things. By midday they had reached higher ground. From the ridge they could see for miles the red mesas, the winding riverbed below, the white streaks of salt flats in the distance. The wind picked up, tugging at their hair, carrying with it the smell of rain from somewhere far away. He reined in his horse and turned toward her. "I owe you my life." "You owe me nothing," she said. "The desert let you live. I only helped." He smiled faintly. "Still feels like more than that." Her gaze met his, sharp but not cold. "You think one good deed makes a debt, then you haven't learned anything out here." He chuckled softly. "Maybe I haven't, but I figure I should at least try to thank you." "Then remember," she said. "Remember what?" "That sometimes a stranger's mercy is stronger than fate." Her voice carried on the wind, steady as stone. For a long time they sat there, the world spread out before them, endless, empty, beautiful. He felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Hope, maybe, or just the quiet peace of not being alone anymore. He glanced at her, the way the light caught in her hair, the calm strength in the line of her shoulders. "You could ride with me," he said softly. "There's a town a few days west. Might be we both could use a place to rest." She turned her head toward him, eyes unreadable. The wind played with the loose strands of her braid. "I go where the wind goes," she said. He looked away, nodding. "I guess I should have expected that." For a moment neither moved. The sun rose higher, turning the sky from gold to white. Then she leaned forward, gave a gentle click with her tongue, and her horse started down the trail. "Where will you go?" he called after her. She didn't turn around. "Where I'm needed." He watched her silhouette grow smaller against the glare of the morning light. She rode without hesitation, as though the land itself opened before her, guiding her steps. He stayed there until the sound of her horse faded into the wind. The silence that followed was not the kind that crushed. It was the kind that filled, the kind that left space for breath, for memory. He looked down at the desert below, vast, unforgiving, alive, and for the first time in a long while he didn't feel lost. He felt chosen. The cowboy adjusted his hat, feeling the sun warm the back of his neck. Somewhere behind him, a hawk cried out, sharp and fierce. He smiled to himself, a quiet, weary smile, and whispered into the empty air, "Thank you, Tala." Then he turned his horse toward the horizon, riding into the dawn. And though he never saw her again, he carried her voice with him always, the Apache woman who had refused to let him die alone, and in doing so, taught him how to live.